Welcome to Back on the Broomstick,
a modern witch's spoken word grimoire,
where two witchy friends from way back are reconnecting to their pagan roots after a long period of mundanity.
We're rewalking the path of the wise and trying out all the latest spells, rituals, and magical theory in today's witchcraft and pagan practices.
So grab your wand and your incense,
your cauldron and your crystals,
and join us
as we get
Back on the Broomstick.
Hi, and welcome to Back on the Broomstick. On this episode, we'll be tackling a divisive topic in tarot. Specifically, are the suit of wands air or fire? And is the suit of swords fire or air? I'm Layla, and I'm excited to let out my inner tarot nerd for this episode.
And I'm Chelle, and I have opinions. Shocking. I have opinions on
We're
that.
surprised. We're all shocked and surprised
Right?
on that one. I know, Chelle, in your ginormous tarot collection, you have decks that use the associations of fire for swords and also some that use the element of fire for wands.
We're at about a handful under 200 in my collection, and I am all for a new deck. I have obtained a couple that have wands listed as fire and swords listed as air. I don't even think I realized that there was a question until maybe 10 years ago. I just thought what I knew was it.
Yeah, it's definitely a question that's come up more often, particularly now that I think that there's so many decks and so many readers out there.
Right.
But before we get into our opinions, let's rewind a little bit and talk more generally about tarot. So a lot of you know that tarot started out as a card game in around 15th century Europe, and it turned into a divination form, maybe 100 or so years later. And now it has become almost an integral part of many people's meditation, self-help, as well as magical and divinatory practices. It's so useful.
Fun fact, in my mundane job, I happened across a resume recently, and at the bottom of this person's resume, they had hobbies and interests listed. And, they were in theater, did this, that, and the other. And the very last thing said tarot reader.
Nice. I've put that on resumes in the past and actually had it be well received. I'm glad to see it's still kind of accepted, but that's a different podcast.
Now, I wanna kind of take it back a little further. This goes a little back to even practice, people's practice, ritual practice, magical practice. I have been a person, this is what I have always been taught, what I learned, fire, swords. Why, you might ask? They're forged in fire. Makes sense?
Well, that's definitely always been my belief as well, that swords are forged in fire and wands come from trees which literally breathe air. I also feel that swords are action, their passion, their anger and emotion, their physicality. They very much fit for me with the element of fire. It's a warrior.
The wood aspect of wands is kind of taking your time, thinking things through, kind of that mental part.
When you think of wands, you think of wizards, you think of magicians, you think of mages, you think of the court mage who was the wise one, who was, they brought wisdom and intelligence to the court. Anyone who's going to study to be a mage has to read books and be involved with the mind. So that very much says air to me.
And books come from trees.
Exactly.
But to kind of circle back to your history, I think that especially between maybe 1500s and 1800s, it was also kind of like the regular playing cards where you had spades, diamonds, clubs, I'm forgetting the other, hearts. I think that maybe how they translated into, cups, pentacles, swords, and wands has a little to do with it as well.
The suits have undergone quite a few different transformations. The wands were originally staves or arrows, and they were considered to be like the arrows of the sun, because a lot of these meanings come from when the Golden Dawn got their hands on these cards. And started putting their beliefs and their high magic. They used astrology, they used numerology, they used Kabbalah. They used the humors. They talk about the elements of the world and the humors of the world. And so they mapped those onto the cards.
I actually have decks where they have the suit labeled as staves.
And pentacles was coins.
Yep.
Cups, I think, have always been cups.
No, I have a deck where they're called bowls.
Modern day now, especially, you'll see all sorts of different names for the suits. Now, the deck that most people are familiar with, the Smith Waite or the Rider Waite Smith deck, came to be in 1910. And we talked about Pixie, Pamela Coleman Smith, who did the art, and Arthur Edward Waite, who was the author of it. He was part of the Golden Dawn. So he went with a lot of their associations for elements. They believed that the rays of the sun, the wands, the staves were fire, and that swords were air because they talk about the sharp intellect, a keen mind, and swords cutting through discourse, I guess.
Now, funny you say that because, as we have talked about for the last year or so, I kind of reverted back to I have the centennial version of what is it? Rider Waite
The
Coleman,
Smith Waite deck.
that one. Yeah. I never knew that that was the interpretation. I just, swords, fire, wands, air, sword south, wands east.
That made sense for you because didn't you start with the Aquarian Tarot and the Witch's Tarot?
I did, and they are very aligned with that,
Yes.
which also at the same time was when I was kind of embedding my Wiccan DNA, that we like to call it. And, ritual wise, magic wise, that's what we were taught,
Hmm.
wands, east, air, swords, south, fire. They went hand in hand, that's
Exactly.
what I was taught for ritual. That's what I was seeing in tarot. I never questioned it.
Yeah, and while Ellen Cannon Reed's The Witch's Tarot and the Aquarian Tarot are two of several decks, there's a few dozen out there, I
A
think,
gazillion.
that have swords as fire and wands as air. The Smith Waite deck does not. And it's interesting that you still read them that way because I did too. My very first deck was a Rider Waite Smith clone. And some people say that the colors on the cards, that you can tell that wands are fire and swords are air by the colors on the Smith Waite deck. And I don't think that's true because the colors are all pretty. In most of these decks, there's oranges and yellows and blues and purples and greens. And I don't see, I'm holding up here so Chelle can see. I've got the Ace of Swords and the Ten of Wands. And if you look at these cards, they both have oranges and reds.
Yeah, the swords has flames.
The sword, although the hand is coming out of a cloud, the sword literally has flames around it. And the staves are growing. They're green and growing and alive, like air. So even though the traditional meanings of the Rider Waite Smith deck are wands fire, swords air, it's very easy to look at the pictures and interpret that using your own system, even if it's flipped.
But I also have two, I'm going to show you. I have the the eight of wands and the nine of wands. Blue,
Mm-hmm.
blue. Okay.
Yep, light blue. It looks like air.
Then I have the knight of swords, ironically, also blue. And I have the seven of swords, which is actually bright yellow.
Right, which I guess could be an air color. Our point here is that no matter what the cards that you're reading show, whether the booklet says swords are air or swords are fire, you can put your own interpretation and your own spin on the elements. Now, there are reasons why these suits are corresponding with elements.
Tell me, Layla, why?
The minor arcana in a tarot deck traditionally stands for like everyday life. This is the mundane. This is getting down into the details. This is the nitty gritty, right? This is where we all live. And the before time people, I guess, the people that came up with tarot and the Golden Dawn felt that elements were an important part of life. And so they mapped these idea of the humors of elements onto the cards.
Four quarters, four suits.
Right, exactly.
I am still blown away that this deck I am using was actually intended for swords for air, like, wands. Like, I am blown away. I did not
right?
know that.
Isn't that great? So they reduced everything to the humors, and they felt that the sword could cut to the quick, being sharp as a tack, cut straight to the truth or straight to the point. There's a lot of phrases like that when it comes to what the swords mean, that it means intellect. And a lot of people will use those symbologies when they talk about why they think swords is air. Now, the arguments for wands being fire is that it's a weapon. Some people talk about it because they can be the clubs or the staves of the arrows of the sun. So they talk about wands being passion and causing that type of energy, bringing that type of energy.
I mean, I can see wands being kind of an action thing, but I feel like I don't want to say small action and big action, but I guess that's what I'm saying. I think to me, wands is more like plotting out the action, and swords is the actual action. Does that make sense? Or am I no?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. I see it that way too. I feel that wands are air because that's intellect. That's you, that's the internal self.
Your
That's
planning stage.
right. And swords, when you pick up a sword, you're ready for action. I had this argument with someone once, and they tried to tell me that swords literally equal words. And my thought on that is no, absolutely not. I was raised by a hunter. I was raised by a man who used guns and knives all the time. And one of the biggest things I was taught is you never pick up a weapon unless you intend to
Unless you're
use
going to
it.
use it.
Exactly. You do not pick up a sword when your intent is to talk.
Right. Good point.
And like you said, trees turn into books. I mean, it just makes so much more sense that way.
Well, I always have this vision of like this huge willow tree where the tree is kind of swaying with and a part of the wind.
Oh, exactly. Yes, I love that imagery. And I don't like it when people talk about an element in terms of what can destroy it or what can be destroyed by it. Wands are fire because they can be destroyed by fire, and swords are air because they can cut through air. That feels like opposites to me. That doesn't feel like working with the element. That feels like destruction to me. So, again, that's another reason why I can't map those meanings on the cards.
I feel like that is almost an attempt to manipulate the element.
Funny you should say manipulate, because some people think there is a theory that says that A.E. Waite actually put out misinformation in an attempt to basically be a gatekeeper. And they say that because the Golden Dawn was so secretive and all this magic was supposed to be secretive, it's said that he switched swords and wands so that only those with true knowledge would get it right. I don't know if I entirely buy it. It's an interesting theory.
Wait, are you saying that I have true knowledge?
Yes, I'm always saying you have true knowledge, Shell. You know
Sweet.
this. There's a lot of books about this, and there's a quote that I really like. Stephen Skinner wrote a book called Techniques of High Magic. And in that book, he talks about how this is a blind, that the swords being air and wands being fire is what he called a blind, that it was taught to beginners. And then later, as they worked their way up, they were taught that it was the other way around, which just seems like a mind fuck to me.
In my opinion, it'd be like if I showed up at your door one day and was like, "Hey, pentacles are emotions and cups are material stability." You'd be like,
Right.
"What?"
What? I'd be like, wait, this isn't what we talked about.
Right, right.
And I guess the theory behind teaching them that way and then later being like, surprise, it's different, was to help initiates know that things aren't set in stone, that you need to be flexible and you need to always be open to learning and new knowledge, which makes a little sense.
I do believe that there is something behind the secrecy with the Golden Dawn and kind of let's switch
Absolutely.
it to confuse people, only because I know that secrecy is a real thing.
Oh, yeah. And these people all wanted to keep the secrets. They all wanted to keep their secrets.
Right, right. And I could see a lot of gatekeeping back in that period where this wasn't, I don't want to say as accepted as it is now, but for lack of better words, yeah.
Yeah, and of course, all these groups. We were there for like the witch wars in the 90s. We know
Right,
some
right.
everybody had their secrets. Everybody liked to gatekeep all their shit. So that would not surprise me at all.
You weren't a witch in the 90s if you weren't gatekeeping something.
Right? One of the things that I found as I've been a reader and that really stuck with me. So I'm big on swords or fire, wands or air. You're gonna pry that out of my cold dead fingers. I'm not letting go. But the Nine of Swords.
What about it?
Okay, I'm gonna pull it up
I
here.
was gonna say, you're gonna make me pull it up.
The Nine of Swords imagery, typically in this Smith-Waite deck and in all Smith-Waite clones, basically. The Nine of Swords is nine swords hanging over a woman who's sitting up in bed, holding her head in her hands as if she's sobbing. This card, to me, could sway me into thinking that swords are air, because this card, to me, almost always says anxiety, mental anguish, internal pain. It's the words that you use against yourself.
That's funny because I feel like I have a different perspective, which is more sword leaning. I've always kind of looked at this as the you've reaped what you've sown.
Oh, say, okay, yeah.
Your actions from those nine swords are why you are sitting in your bed with your face in your hands having a meltdown.
Yes, it's guilt.
I've always kind of leaned towards the you've reaped what you sowed, which is more in line with the whole swords fire thing.
Yes. And you know what? I absolutely do have that meaning for it as well. What it made me think of is that swords and wands as two sides of the same coin, two sides of the same weapon.
I could agree with that.
I think swords externally are that brash, the fighting, the anger, the strong warrior, the energy to move you forward.
The wands are the internal.
But I do think swords internally are air. It's the anxiety, it's the words you use against yourself, it's that mental anguish. It can be instability or bad mental health.
Yeah, but with the swords being fire, it is those things being a part of your reality.
Yes, those external actions can cause that internal strife. So I see it as both.
Whereas I see wands is the internal strife, and the swords is that playing out in reality.
But I see wands more as internal education, as more knowledge seeking, less mental anxiety. So more the positive side of that.
Then how are you explaining that with the 10?
The swords are the negative, wands are the
Oh, okay,
positive.
okay,
No,
okay.
swords are that negative self-talk, that internal anxiety, that bitch that won't shut up when you're trying to go to sleep.
For real.
That's
Hate
the
her.
air sword internal. I just feel like they're both two sides of the same thing. And I think the swords are the negative self-talk and wands are the positive self-talk. Swords are that energy, that go get 'em, that it doesn't necessarily have to be negative energy or negative action. It's just powerful and strong, fiery action. Whereas wands are more of a calculated, steady, knowledgeable action. So, they both have positive and negative sides, but I really do feel like they can be read either way.
I agree with two sides of the same coin, but I kind of look at it more as the wands are the mental thinking it out, thinking it through, and the swords are these are your decisions in action.
But the Nine of Swords, even if that person is in anguish over their actions, they're still in mental anguish. It's still a card of mental anguish. So that's why I feel that that's the internal air sword causing that mental anguish.
But that mental anguish was caused by action,
Exactly. By that fire, the action, the
by
external.
those nine swords made you feel that way.
Right. Your actions, those nine fiery swords, that negative fiery action is what gave you that internal guilt. Totally agree.
And then the 10 is kind of, you know, you done fucked up.
The Ten of Swords, that's a person laying on the ground with 10 swords in their back. And that traditionally is defeat, painful endings, betrayal. And that, I can't really ascribe air or fire to that. I think I could do either one because if it's fire,
It hurts. You were burned.
it could have been your actions, it could have been your words, it could have been anything that caused you to be in that position, but you did it. It's your fault that you're there.
Although I will say there, I've done readings for people where that has come up and they are reaping the shit of someone else's actions. But
Sure. Yeah,
bottom
absolutely.
line is actions got you to that
Have
card.
consequences, right? Right. And you could read that either as a fire or an air element. Now, why is this important? Is it important? Yes and no. It depends on how much importance you want to put on it.
My vote is no, it's not important because my biggest thing with tarot is read all the books you want, look at all the YouTube videos, whatever. But when you look at those cards, what is it saying to you? And if when you are using your intuition and your ability and whatever, if you look at that Nine of Swords and it's talking air to you, fucking roll with it. I'm just telling you it doesn't to me. It's
Right.
talking fire, but we all look at things a little differently. We all have our own kind of personal interpretation. So I don't think either is wrong. I just know what I do.
I a million times agree because there are so many decks out there. Some of them use elements as the suits. Some switch them up. Some use all sorts of weird shit as the suits. And it's up to you to find which ones resonate with you. I am of a mind with tarot. I want you to learn the basics. I want you to learn what are the archetypes, what's the symbology, and even what are the astrological symbolism if that speaks to you because it might not. It's not on all decks. Does the Kabbalah work for you? Does the elemental associations work for you? Because when you lay a card down next to another card in a spread, they start to work together. They start to weave together all of their symbology, all their archetypes, all their meanings.
Together they tell a story,
Exactly. And so the nuances of one will change depending on
depending
what
on
it's
what's
next
next
to.
to.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so sometimes those elements, if you've got a reading that's almost entirely air and there's one water card, you might want to know why that's there. Or if there's one fire card, you might want to know why that's there and if it's going to set off a bonfire. So that can change how a reading is interpreted. But I will tell you that astrology and Kabbalah and even elements are probably like sixth, seventh, nothing on my list of where I consider them when I do a reading, I guess.
But as it would relate to magical practice and ritual, I think whatever you adopt in your tarot is how you're going to lean in ritual. You're
Yeah.
not going to have wands be fire in a tarot reading and then turn around and have wands be air in a ritual.
And I have worked, and I know you have too. We have both worked with people in the past that cast air or call air with swords and, have a staff in the South for fire. So I've seen it. It doesn't resonate, but I've seen it.
I mean, that's fine, but then if I forget, they just can't be mad at me.
That's right.
Creature of habit, creature of habit. But I again think that neither way is wrong. It's what the reader, what their personal interpretation is, because you're the one who is creating that connection with the cards and forming that relationship. And my relationship with my deck isn't going to be the same as your relationship with your deck.
Mhm.
And my quote unquote conversations with my readings aren't going to be the same as yours. So I don't think either way is wrong. But
No, it's not.
if I'm teaching you tarot, wands are air and swords are fire.
Yeah.
Bottom line.
I really loved that earlier we were talking about how you were shocked that the Smith Waite deck was actually wands, fire, swords, air. And I freaking love that because it's such a good point that it doesn't matter. You weren't looking at the book. I mean, you probably haven't looked at a Smith Waite book in a million years, so you don't need it. So it never would have occurred to you. And the symbology on the cards is easy enough to interpret elementally any way you want to.
Absolutely. I mean, I am still kind of shocked that I didn't even realize that. And it's exactly why. I mean, I don't read the pamphlet books. I open up a deck, I use it, off we go. I guess I just assumed. And now I'm like looking at this deck and I'm like, did I miss something in the message she was trying to put through with her artwork? And as I look at these, no, I stand
No.
by my way.
I don't think the suits are ever always one thing. And especially with the proliferation of so many different types of decks to appeal to different magical brains, I think you should just, look for one that works for you. And we tell stories with the cards. Even though I think that you should memorize the traditional meanings of the deck that you're using, and you should look into the symbology, you should look into these different pieces because once you know the numerology, you can start to look at why there's too many fours in that reading or what that means when there's a seven next to a nine. And it adds a lot of depth, but you shouldn't get hung up on it. You shouldn't get hung up on the shoulds, should do this or should do that, especially if you're using it for your own personal use.
Now, when I realized that there was such a conversation happening, like I said, maybe 10 or so years ago, I got into Rachel Pollack's book, fabulous book, 78 Degrees of Wisdom. Everyone should check it out.
Love that book.
I was like, wait, what is she talking about? And, there were some things that I kind of had to flip in my head, what she was talking about, with swords and wands. I kind of had to, okay, in my mind, she really means this about wands. And
Right. You have to do a little transposing.
I did, but I also noted, what is she saying about the Four of Swords versus the Four of Wands? And am I really flipping the meanings or the sentiment? And sometimes her meaning for the Four of Swords totally fit with the Four of Wands. Like, you know what I mean? It's but
Yeah.
you have to pick away in your head, stick with it, and then if you are reading other people's work, information, what have you, you kind of have to do that flip in your head.
And I think that's why keeping a personal diary of your own meanings, like when we talked about charm casting and we talked about keeping a journal of what each charm means to you and how that changes as you do different throws, we recommend that you do regular tarot pulls. And you should start to keep a book of what those cards mean to you, what different symbolism keeps coming up over and over again. And as you study and learn and grow, you can add to that rather than having to do the math in your head of switching Four of Swords to Four of Wands.
Right.
You'll have your own journal to go back to where you can do that.
Well, and I've done that over the last couple decades with a couple of different decks because, maybe the symbolism I got out of Ellen Cannon Reed's Witch's Tarot is different than, the Starseed Tarot, which
Right.
love, remember?
Mm-hmm.
So I've kind of journaled different decks and different cards. I hate to say
Mm-hmm.
that I journaled and it kills me to admit that,
I love it.
but I will always agree when it comes to tarot. But I think the most productive thing you can do for yourself is every day pick a card. I mean, we're talking 78 cards, 78 days. You can spare 2 months of your life for a minute. Look at that card and write down, like you said, write down what it means to you. Create your own meaning book because what this card means to you or me or Rachel Pollack or Lori Cabot or whoever you're talking about, that's our interpretation, our intuition, our gut feelings. My gut feeling and intuition isn't going to be yours or the next person's. So you need to spend time with each of these cards and create your own meaning book because that little pamphlet book that comes in the box with it,
It's not enough.
I was going to say, think of that as more like a guideline,
Yeah, a place to start.
but not a full meaning. You
Yeah.
need to take the time to find that full meaning.
Now, I'm a very visual person. Everything on the card means something to me. The colors, the symbols, the shapes, the composition, all of
Well,
it.
they wouldn't have put it on the card if it didn't mean something.
Exactly, exactly. And honestly, I feel like I'm always finding something new when I'm doing my daily pulls or tarot meditation and I'm looking at a card or studying a card. It's always surprising to me the new thing that jumps out or the nuance that I'll notice.
But you might not have noticed that in the last
Right.
10 readings.
Exactly. But this reading, this particular color is jumping out, or the crown on the queen is jumping out at me. And that's what I tell my students too, is pay attention to those things that jump out because that might mean something more important to you now than it did when you first looked at that card, or the fifth reading you did with that card. Now that part of it's different and that part of it has meaning. So you're always going to be finding new elements, new nuances of each card, especially as they relate to each other. There's an infinite number of combinations.
And that's why even despite having like 200 decks, I've kind of stuck with only using a handful over the years because you create that connection, and like who has time to be doing that 200 times?
Exactly. It can be nice to use a deck you're not familiar with for a daily pull just to kind of get into it, to, do something different. But if you're doing some serious readings for yourself or for someone else,
Pick one and stick with it.
yeah, you need something that you're very, very familiar with, that the correspondences and everything really speak to you and that you know inside and out.
I mean, geez, I used that witch's tarot for what, 25 years
Yeah,
before I switched?
so much so that you kept the meanings on the Rider-Waite-Smith deck.
For real, for real.
Because most of these suits are so well drawn, unless you pick something that has very plain pip cards, it allows you to just go with what's there. Just go with how the image speaks to you. Have your knowledge, do your studying, and then just kind of let it go from there. Let it tell you a story.
I think kind of the moral of our point here is you really got to figure out what works for you. Wands is air and swords is fire is what works for Layla and I. But if it is the ass opposite for you, go with it. You're not wrong. Follow your intuition because you are the one reading those cards. That is your relationship with that deck, and the unique language you have between you and that deck is yours and yours alone.
Exactly. The tarot is your key to your subconscious and yours alone. And if you're the one doing the reading, you control all of that. So, as much as I say you should learn the traditional meanings, you should learn the book meanings, once you've studied that, then give your own intuition free rein and just let it go. You are not wrong if your elemental correspondences don't match up to what everyone else says. It's okay to go your own way.
But I do think if you really want to immerse yourself in tarot, whether you want to read for yourself frequently, read for other people, make a business out of it, whatever, you're going to really have to take the time and connect with each card individually and create that relationship where you know what that card is telling you, despite what the book, that little booklet says.
All right, so before we let go, I'm going to give you one quick story because you made me think of a funny. Now, the deck that I have, this is the Games Tarot. I have to look up exactly what it's called. It's just a generic Rider-Waite-Smith clone. It was published in the early 70s and it was given to me by my grandmother. And I fucking love this deck. I actually had to go out and find it again to replace it because my dog chewed up a couple of them. But anyway, point. When I first got these cards, I was told that I needed to sleep with them under my pillow. So I did the whole deck. And then I took them one card at a time. And not only would I write it in my journal, but I would put it under my pillow that night. And when I woke up in the morning, I would write down any dreams or any thoughts that I had about that card.
I flailed too much in my sleep. I would have ripped the damn thing to shreds without even knowing it.
Thank the gods I did not. But no, that's what I did. I took my 78 days. I think it was more like 378 because I am not consistent. But I took my time and I journaled each card, put it under my pillow, and would write a little story about each card, just going on the colors and the pictures and what it looked like. I would write a little story. I wish I still had that journal.
I don't know if you remember this, but I very distinctly remember this. I was barely, if even 20 something, and I got that Aquarian deck, which in retrospect, what the hell?
Bad
Hardest deck on the
idea.
planet to read, Lord. Which I ended up, I lost it and I did replace it because even though I despise that deck,
It's
it
your
was the very
first
first
deck.
one. Right. But I don't know if you remember this, but I remember going to you and saying, I can't figure it out. These things suck, whatever. And what you made me do something ridiculous. It was like you made me have a conversation with each card.
That sounds like something I would do.
You were like, sit quietly, meditate, and talk to the card, and it'll talk back to you.
That definitely sounds like something I'd say.
I don't know. That was how I started.
Did it work?
not with that deck. It wasn't until shortly after we started doing a lot of magical things in our early 20s that I came across that Ellen Cannon read. And that, even to this day, I mean, I could whip that out and boom, boom, boom.
Love
That
that
deck,
deck.
that deck just spoke to me in a way that I just remember thinking, who the hell made that Aquarian deck? Because that is some crazy non-helpful thing.
Yeah.
So I think that especially for me, just because it's your first deck and the one you buy doesn't make it the one that's going to speak to you.
It's a
You
good
know what I
point.
mean?
Yes, yes. It doesn't mean you have to keep using it. You can always change it up. I started out with my first deck and used it for years and then have moved on to several different decks. The Londa Tarot was the one
Oh, I
I
remember you
mostly.
loved that Londa
I
Tarot.
did, I did. I still do. It's a great deck.
Didn't it have an extra card?
It did. It had a
Yep.
Who Are You Really card that I loved. It had a 79th card. Loved that. But yeah, so, and then I moved to the Witches Tarot. Now I use all sorts of different decks. So do what works. You have to use what speaks to you. If it doesn't fit right in your brain, it's going to be a stumbling block every time you try to read. So you really do need to find how it flows naturally for you.
And I think one thing I had done at one point was, and I think this is maybe a helpful tip, I don't know, start with your aces. Spend some time with your aces because your aces will tell you what they mean, I feel like. They are kind of that kickoff to the suit, the start of the suit, the seed of that suit.
Hmm.
Those aces are going to tell you what they are and where they fall.
Oh, I like that. And I think it's good to start there too, because the court cards make things so much more confusing. Because once you get into the court cards, then you've got like the kings are typically earth, the queens are water, the knights are fire, and the pages are air. The queen of cups would be water, water.
The water of
The
water.
water of water, that's right. The king of cups would be the earth of water. The knight of cups would be the fire of water. So, you can get those associations all mixed up in there as
You are
well.
adding another crazy layer for these folks.
I know. And we're not even going to get into the major arcana.
But, you know, I also remember a time where I did a lot of working. You know how some people would do the major only?
Hmm.
Flip the switch, people. Do a couple readings with the minor only. Take all 22 majors out and just do a pip reading.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, majors are tough, man. Majors can be hard to read. They're overarching themes, they're big events, they're life.
Telling me stuff I don't want to hear.
Right? When you want to get into the details, it's the minor arcana that's really going to carry the work of the reading and tell you all the little things that you need to know.
How I got that idea was people used to use playing cards for divination. And when they did that, they only had the 52 ultimately pip cards. And that's kind of what gave me the, hey, let's see how this goes. And I agree, that kind of gives you a more nitty-gritty. I don't need the big stuff right now. I need the bits and pieces.
Right, right. The major arcana is like talking to your psychiatrist that talks over your head a little bit. And the minor arcana are like talking to your
Crazy aunt.
bestie. You're talking to your crazy aunt who's going to tell you like it is and give you some good advice.
Talking to your grandma, major arcana. Talking to Layla and Chelle, pip cards.
I love it. Yeah. Well, hey, I think that's some pretty good information right there. If you have any questions about tarot, if you have your own controversial take on tarot cards, let us know. Send us an email backonthebroomstick@gmail.com.
The holidays were long and family friendly, so look to see a little more online activity from us.
Our next episode is going to be about the upcoming holiday of Imbolc. We'll talk about history, rituals, spells, all sorts of things that you can do.
And one other thing about our upcoming in bulk episode, for those of you who are keeping track, counting numbers, and taking score, this will be an anniversary.
That's right. Imbolc, I believe February 2nd, which is not Imbolc. Imbolc is February 1st.
And it's one of our hosts' birthday who's not me.
Ha! Wonder who that could be. But February 2nd, I think, is our 2-year anniversary of Back on the Broomstick. That will also be, let's see, this is episode 98,
Oh my God. Oh my
right?
God. Oh my God.
So that means our lead up to In Bulk episode will be 99. And the last episode of January will be our 100th episode right before our 2-year anniversary.
All right, folks. I didn't tell Layla that I was going to say this because it literally just came to me, and I'm really kind of the unexpected one of us too.
Spit it out, woman.
I want all of our listeners, we love you, every one of you, especially the ones that like to contact us frequently.
We love you guys.
I want you to either email us or message us on Facebook. What are your ideas? Layla and I have a plan already, obviously, but I want to know what you guys want to hear for our special 100th episode.
Ooh,
And if we find something super cool and interesting, we will deviate from what we already have scheduled for our 100th episode.
I
But
like it.
I want to know what you want to know for number 100.
What should we do for our 100th episode?
We always talk about what we think you want to hear about. Tell us what you want to hear about for our 100th episode. I'm waiting.
Ooh, email us backonthebroomstick@gmail.com. We will happily take all your suggestions. But in the meantime, get your journals out, get your tarot cards out, make sure you are doing your daily pulse.
Meditate and keep it witchy.
Did you just say meditate?
Shush, don't repeat that.